Hey everyone, in this video we're going to take a look at the story from chapter 32 of the Road to Latin textbook called De Procae Filiis I. So just as a quick reminder, if you want more resources on the chapter, the grammar, the vocab, the story, anything like that, or just see it in a different way, feel free to go to Nova Latin. You'll find a bunch of stuff there, my notes, just things that'll kind of help you through in case you want more practice or just resources to work your way through this textbook. So before you dive into the story, what I always tell, I tell my students and you on these videos is the first thing you got to do is make sure you have the vocab under control. It's almost impossible to read these stories if you don't know the vocab because you're just not going to know what the words mean. So always start with the vocab. Another thing I'd recommend, look at the grammar, right? Even if you just give it a quick scan to understand what the grammar is and what the stories are trying to kind of flesh out for you, it's a much better way of learning to know the grammar in advance, at least know what it is, and see it in context of the story. I think it would be tricky to read the story, not have any idea what the grammar is trying to do, and then go backwards and unpack it. The stories are really there to bring the grammar to life and show it to you in context. So I'd recommend you look at the grammar first. And we'll do that in this video too before we dive too far in, but you could do it on your own. Use Nova Latin. You can find a bunch of notes and things to help you understand it. The other thing I'd say is if you can find a classmate, read the story aloud, right? Don't just read and translate in your head. Read it aloud, work on your speaking, your pronunciation. If you can find a classmate to read it back to you, you can work on your listening skills. These are all really great ways to bring the language to life and help you learn it, right? Sometimes you're just more of an auditory learner. You don't want to shut off those sort of those avenues of learning with speaking, listening. You don't want to turn those off, right? So try to do that at least a couple times. And if you have, like I said, a classmate, it makes it a little easier to do. The last thing I'd say in terms of learning these stories, try the read and reread method. I say it a lot, but I've seen it work. I know that it works. If you read through this story once, write down any problem areas you're having, the vocab, the grammar, anything that's tripping you up, then go back, look up all the words you don't know, try to unpack the grammar you didn't understand, and then read the story again, a second, a third, a fourth time, however many times you need until you can read this story and understand it without needing any dictionary help for vocab or any grammar help. That's how you know you've really got this story down and you can move on. Okay, so working through this video, if you already understand the grammar, feel free to jump ahead to my translation part. If you don't, we're going to do grammar right now. And make sure that you've actually tried to read the story on your own. You don't want my translation to be the first time you're hearing it. I don't think that's the most useful thing. Read through it, right? Do the read and reread method. And when you've done that and you feel confident, then look at the way I'm translating it. If what I'm saying is matching up with what you had or pretty close to it, you can feel good that you've got this story under control. Okay, so like I said, we're going to start with a quick grammar review, and this is actually a pretty dense topic, so you want to read through the notes either from the Road to Latin book or my site. Do something to try to help yourself out with this, but the grammar is on third-person pronouns. So we did first and second in the previous chapter. This is third-person pronouns, so is, id. It's basically how we say he, she, or it in Latin. Remember, a pronoun stands in for a noun. So instead of saying someone's name, you're just saying he, she, or it, right? The trick here is third person pronouns have gender, right? And they use the first and second declension adjective endings. So there is a difference between he, she, and it. That's the masculine, feminine, and neuter forms, right? Which we didn't see with the others. The other kind of trick is third person pronouns actually do show possession. So in other words, if you use the genitive singular, eos, you're saying his, hers, or its. You're showing possession. And we'll unpack in this chapter the difference between saying hers, meaning someone else's, and her own, meaning the same as the speaker. Okay, there's a lot more to it, but I'm going to just jump to the chart. This is really what you're after. Okay, so this is a chart of the third person pronoun. You have is, id, right? He, she, it, and the different forms of it. Okay, and this is another kind of trick or a difference rather between Latin and English. In English, when you say they or them, you can't tell if you're talking about like a different gender, basically. In Latin, you can because it's spelled differently. So a, masculine, is a different form of them than ai, the feminine, or ea, the neuter. So if I say they did something and I use the term ai, eae, I know that I'm talking about a group of women or girls, some feminine noun. Right? So that's kind of a key difference here. So we'll see it in the story as we go, but you want to work these through as you're kind of practicing the story. Third person pronouns are pretty straightforward, but still they take a little getting used to. The other part of the grammar is relative pronouns. So we're taking all these pronouns together, right? And we're adding one more here. The relative pronoun is qui, quae, quod. So basically it means who, right? Who, whom, which, that sometimes, right? That's basically what it is. But a relative pronoun, it's just another pronoun, right? A word that refers to another noun, right? That's why we call them pronouns. They give more information about that noun, though. That's kind of the key thing they're doing, right? They set up what we call a relative clause. The person or the thing that a relative pronoun refers to is called the antecedent, right? Literally the thing that came before. The relative pronoun is going to match its antecedent in gender and number, but not case. We'll talk about this as we kind of work through the story, okay? But the case of a relative pronoun depends on what it's doing in its own clause. We call these relative clauses. And again, I'll show you in a second what I mean. But this is our chart of the relative pronoun, right? So you see qui, quae, quo, which basically means who, right? Just different genders of the word who, what, that, something along those lines, okay? And you can kind of see it all here, how it lays out. So one thing you're gonna notice is right off the bat, a lot of the endings should look familiar. They're first and second declension adjective endings or noun endings, depending on how you want to think about it, right? There's some tweaks in there, but in general, the endings are pretty straightforward for things you've seen. So like particularly in the plural, you can see e, orum, ibus, os, ibus. I know that ibus is not necessarily second declension, but e, orum, os, we've seen these kind of endings before for masculine. Same with the feminine and the neuter, okay? So what we're going to do is bring this together into something called a relative clause, right? So relative clauses are introduced by a relative pronoun. So basically a clause is a part of a sentence that has its own subject and a verb. And there's two kind of different types you can think about it. A main clause is the part of the sentence that can stand as its own, right? A complete thought. A relative clause is something we call a subordinate clause. It gives us more information about the main clause, right, with the word who, but it can't stand on its own as a complete thought. Okay, so an example of kind of main versus subordinate would be if you said, while Titus eats dinner, a soldier enters. The main clause is a soldier enters, right? You could say that as a sentence, hey, a soldier enters, and it makes sense. The relative clause, the subordinate clause here wouldn't stand on its own. So if you said, while Titus eats dinner, that can't really stand on its own, right? It's not a complete thought. It's the same with relative clauses. It would be the equivalent of saying something like, I see the boy who is happy, right? Who is happy is not a complete thought. It's just giving you more information about the boy, right? In the phrase, I see the boy. That's what we're getting at with relative clauses here and kind of the difference between a main clause and a subordinate. I'm going to leave it here because there's a lot to it that we just can't do in this video. But I'd encourage you to go look through the textbook or look through my site. There's a bunch of stuff there, videos that'll help you understand what a relative pronoun is and how it works in a relative clause. Same with third person pronouns. And I'll explain it as we go through this video. So let's just dive in, right? And hopefully you've read through it a few times before you start here. But we're going to try to point out these clauses as we go and the pronouns as we go as well. So story starts like this. You have multos annos, reges albae longae regnaverant. So for many years, kings had ruled, regnaverant, right? It's pluperfect. They had ruled in alba longa. Alba longa there is the locative. Okay. Then you have Procae fuit rex clarus albanorum. So here we have Procae, right? This story is called the sons of Procae, right? It's talking about his descendants, right? So Procae was a famous king, a rex clarus, right? Of the Albans. Okay. The Alba Longa, they're called the Albans, right? So he was a famous king. Then you have is duos filios habuit. Here we have our third person pronoun, is, right? It's masculine, nominative, singular. It means he because it's taking the place of the name Procae, which is a man's name. Okay, so you're saying he habuit, he had duos filios, two sons. There's your accusative. Eos filii erat numitor et amulius. So the sons of him, eos filii, or you could say his sons, right? And again, eos there is that pronoun. It's genitive singular. It means his or of him, and it actually is showing possession, right? So his sons were numitor and amulius, two famous brothers. Okay. Then you have numitor erat maior natu, itaque ei regnum datum est. So here we're saying numitor was maior natu is sort of like an idiom. The book tells you to translate it as he was the older, right? It literally means something like born greater, right? Born older. So he's the older of the two. And so regnum, rule, right? Kingship, datum est was given. Datum est is perfect passive, was given to him, right? It's dative because it involves given. So numitor was the older brother, so he gets the kingship. Sed amulius malus homo eum cum filio et filia a regno pepulit. So you're saying, but amulius, a malus homo, right? A wicked man, right? A wicked person. Pepulit, he drove him, pepulit eum, right? There's eum, the pronoun him, right? It's talking about numitor, right? So he didn't drive himself. That would be reflexive. He drove him, meaning another person. So amulius drove numitor, or drove him, cum filio et filia a regno, with his son, filio, and his daughter, filia, from the kingdom, right? He drove him out of the kingdom, okay? So Amulius takes over. Etiam tum amulius fratrum et eos liberos timeba. So also then, right, or even then, you might say, amulius timeba, he was afraid of, or he was fearing his brother, right? So he was fearing fratrem, his brother, and liberos eios, his children. Eios there is the pronoun, but literally the children of him, meaning of numitor. And again, this is showing possession. When you use a third person pronoun, it's not the same as the speaker. So it's not saying Mulius feared his own children. It's saying he feared his, meaning someone else's children, numitor's children. Okay? Itaque ab eo filius numitoris interfectus est, et filia rea Silvia sacerdos vestae facta est. So filius numitoris, the son of numitor, interfectus est, was killed by him, ab eo, right? The him there is another pronoun referring to Amulius. So in other words, Amulius killed numitor's son. And his daughter, Rea Silvia, famous name, right? His daughter, Rea Silvia, facta est, was made a sacerdos vestae, a priestess of Vesta, one of the Vestal virgins. Okay, ea tamen a Marte deo belli amabator. So ea here is another third person pronoun, right? Nominative singular, but it's feminine, so it's referring to a woman or a girl, right? The Rea Silvia is who it's referring to. So you say she, however, right? She, however, amabator, was loved, passive, by Mars, a Marte, the deo belli, the god of war, right? So she was loved by Mars, the god of war. Then you have eos filii erant Romulus et Remus, Gemini. So the sons of him, or of her, I guess you'd say, it's probably talking about the mother. So her sons were Romulus and Remus, the Gemini, the twins. Okay? Pueri parvi ei erant cari. So the small boys, the pueri parvi, the little boys, they were dear, erant cari, they were dear to her, ei, right, to her. So in other words, she loves her children, right? It's kind of the idea. Said Amulius eam in custodiam tradidit et geminos ab ea rapuit. So, but Amulius, remember technically their grandfather, the king who stole it, the throne, he tradidit eam, he handed over her in custodiam, into custody, meaning he put her under arrest. So the eam there is feminine. It has to be referring to Rea Silvia, right? Because of the feminine, third person pronoun again. So he handed over her into custody. And Rapuit, he snatched away the Geminos, the twins, ab ea, from her. Again, ea there, ablative singular, feminine, third person pronoun. It means from her. It's talking about Rea Silvia. So he steals the boys. Then you have pueri in arca positi sunt et in flumen tiberam iacti sunt. So the boys, positi sunt, they were placed, perfect passive, in an arca, in like an ark or a box, however you want to think of that. And iacti sunt, they were thrown into the flumen tiberam, into the Tiber River, right? Sort of has like Moses vibes to it. So they throw the boys into the river. Tum crebi imbres in flumen venerant, itaque it erat altum. So then, or at that time, then you could say, crebi imbres are dense rains, like heavy rains, when erant had come in flumen, into the river, meaning there was a lot of rain. And so itaque id, now id here is a third person pronoun, neuter. So it's talking about the river, right? The Tiber River, that's why it's id. So it was altum, it was high. And notice how altum is also neuter, nominative singular. So the river was high. Then you have in eos ripas aqua redundaverat et flumen nunc palatium tangebat rather. So in its banks, in the banks, in ripas eos, of it, right? You're talking about the river, so eos here means it. Remember, eos is spelled the same way for masculine, feminine, and neuter. So in its banks, the water, redundaverat, means like it had overflowed, is kind of one way to translate that. So it had overflowed, or you might say the river, the water, had overflowed onto or into the banks of the river, meaning it went up on the sides. And flumen nunc palatium, so in the river now, tangebat, it was touching the palatium, the Palatine Hill. So the river rises because of the rain, and now it's going right up to the Palatine Hill in Rome. Okay? Then you have proxima ei sub palatio erat arbor antiqua. So near, proxima, so nearby, you might say, there was an arbor antiqua, an ancient tree, right? And nearby to it, you might say, proxima ei, meaning to the river. So nearby to the river, under the palatio, at the foot of, you might say, the Palatine Hill, there was an ancient tree. So at the foot of the hill, they find this tree, and it's right near the river. And again, ei there, to it, it's talking about the river, it's another pronoun. You have paucirami arboris flumen tetigerant et arcam constituerant. So a few branches, arboris, of the tree, tetigerant, touched the flumen, the river. right? So a few of the branches were actually down touching the river. And constituerant, they held, you could say, arcum, the ark, the box, whatever, the chest, whatever the kids are in. So some of the branches are in the picture, it's really the roots of the tree. But the tree is basically holding the box onto the riverbank and saving the kids. Non diutius erat flumen altum arca in terra relicta era. So non diutius means like for a long time, diutius. So for a long time, there was, or not for a long time, I guess you'd say, was the river altum, high. So another way to say that is the river was not high for a long time, right? It's kind of one way to do it. So the arca, the ark, relicta era, it had been left in terra, on the ground, right? Or on the land. So in other words, the river rises up, the tree holds the ark, the river recedes, and now the ark, the box, whatever it is on the ground. Okay, and the kids are safe. Paulo post lupa ad flumen venet. So a short time after, or a little after, you could say Paulo post, a lupa, the she-wolf, right, the famous she-wolf, came to the river ad flumen venet. Lupa pueros in venet et servavet. So the she-wolf in Waynett found the boys, right, pueros in Waynett, and servavet, and saved the boys, right? The boys is kind of the direct object of both. So the wolf comes down and saves them. This is going to be the famous story of Romulus and Remus being spared, or saved rather, by the she-wolf. Okay, famous story. So hopefully that story made sense and you got to see a lot of the pronouns and see them in action. Okay, if you want more information on this is the Romulus and Remus story. I can link part of my site has a culture unit on this. So if you don't know what the story is, you should look it up so you can understand kind of what's going on here. But these characters are famous, right? The descendants of Aeneas. You have Numitor, Amulius, you have Rhea Silvia, Romulus and Remus. This is all great stuff. The she-wolf story, it's all kind of coming together here. So I'd encourage that you look a little bit of the mythology up just so you can understand what the story is. But if you have any questions on the translation, anything you didn't understand, put it in the comments below. I'm happy to help. But otherwise, keep practicing, keep at it. And like I always tell you, the more you read and reread as many times as you have to, the more you practice, the more this is going to make sense. Good luck.